And can we start?
Yes, we're live on YouTube, Mayor.
Very good. This is a special meeting. We're going to take up the recommendations and the work of the Charter Commission, which we're grateful for all of the hard work that you all did. We're going to try to zoom in the chair. That work is going on, but in the meantime, let's go and proceed with the Pledge of Allegiance led by Councilor Romero Worth, salute to the New Mexico flag led by Councilor Cassett, and the invocation led by Councilor Lindell. So please rise.
I pledge allegiance to the flag, of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I salute the flag of the state of New Mexico, be a symbol of perfect friendship among the united soldiers.
If you care to join me in the we version of the Serenity Prayer. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Are there any remembrances this session? Councilor Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just want to remember the life and dedicated service of Archbishop Michael Shinn. He was a leader of the Catholic community, and not only here in Santa Fe, but northern New Mexico and their surrounding communities. And just want to thank him for everything he did for our community and to make us better, move us forward. And as he oftenly said, love one another. Rest in peace, Archbishop Shinn.
Thank you. Others? I just mentioned that we just passed D-Day, and it's always a time to reflect on the courage of those who were fighting for liberty at a time when the world was very dark and went ashore to change the tide of history. And people in our community who are dealing with pain and suffering. Let's just take a minute and think of all of them. Thanks, everybody. Madam Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Yes, Mayor Weber,
Present.
Councilor Cassett,
Here.
Councilor Chavez, here, Councilor Lee Garcia, Councilor Michael Garcia,
Present.
Councilor Lindell, Councilor Rivera,
Here.
Councilor Mayor Worth,
Here.
Councilwoman Villarreal.
Present.
Everyone's here.
Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, call the roll.
Councilor Cassett,
Yes.
Councilor Chavez.
Yes.
Councilor Lee Garcia,
Yes.
Councilor Michael Garcia,
Yes.
Councilor Lindell,
Yes.
Councilor Rivera, Councilor Mayor Worth,
Yes.
Councilwoman Villarreal,
Yes.
Mayor Weber.
Yes.
Motion has been approved.
Do we have the chair zooming in on us yet? In with us, not on.
Not yet, Mayor.
Why don't we, as we wait for that, I think maybe the city attorney can give us a brief overview of where we are, what we're doing, and what we're going to try to achieve today. And then I'll talk a little bit about process. And hopefully we'll get Nancy in the.
Sounds good, Mayor. The clerk's going to read in our first caption and I will provide some background information.
Item 7A is discussion of Charter Commission recommendations presented by our city attorney, Aaron McSherry.
Thank you. Mayor Weber, councilors,
I'm sorry, point of order. The chair needs a link. Can we get her one?
email just or had gone out a little bit ago. Okay, we're forwarding it to her now. Mayor Weber, Commission, or counselors, we're with three of the commissioners from the Charter Review Commission this year. Chair Nancy Long will be joining us very shortly. And subcommittee chairs Peter Ives and Paul Deerdeck are also with us, who were active participants leading those subcommittees. So they're available to answer questions and maybe explain some of their thoughts and reasonings for the recommendation. Very appreciative that the three of them could be here today after the work of the commission has completed. I also just want to note that Pat Vigali is here, who also helped quite a bit with some of the subcommittee work from my team. And so she's able to help. She's available for most of the meeting, I believe has to leave potentially before the end, how long, depending on how long this lasts. Marcos Martinez will be joining us as soon as he's able. He's on a field trip with one of his clients today in the utilities department related to litigation, I believe. And then also back in the back of the room, we've got Marcy E. Honorino, who is our policy and legislation innovation manager, and our new intern, Natalia Sabato, who's working in our legislation and innovation office from the Academy of Technology and Classics. So the two of them are here to understand the governing body's discussion on this topic in case there's legislation that results. So the purpose here is to better understand the commission's recommendations through discussion. If the governing body wishes to pursue any of those recommendations, they can be proposed in a resolution. And that's where the ballot question language would be adopted by the governing body. So we'd follow our regular process for a resolution, and we'll talk about the specific dates. And I'm going to send an email here shortly with all those dates outlined of the process and the deadlines that we have with the county clerk of Santa Fe County. Make sure we meet those. And I guess that's it. There's definitely going to be opportunity, depending on what the governing body wishes to do, to discuss further any proposals you want to pursue through the form of the committee process as well. So I think today is more of an information gathering rather than a decision-making session to make sure everyone has that opportunity. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I think your last comment is spot on. When we received the report at a governing body meeting, there were hands up saying, can we ask questions? And I think we had a pretty jam-packed agenda that night. So the point of this special meeting is to give anyone on the governing body a chance to ask clarifying questions that might help each of us do a better job of evaluating the recommendations that have been forwarded to us from the commission. What I'd like to propose, and I thought it worked well with the chart report, was that we allocate 10 minutes per person to try to raise questions. If there are people who don't want their 10 minutes, that'll be more time for everybody. I know that there's a quality of life committee meeting this evening or late this afternoon. And so we can if we can get our work done in an expeditious manner, everybody on that committee will have a chance to have some downtime rather than rush from one committee meeting to the next. So if that's okay, yeah, Councilwoman.
Mayor, may I suggest if somebody, whether it's the chair or the subcommittee chairs, can just give us a quick summary of the process? Like once you all were selected and then kind of how you divvied up the work. Just briefly, if someone could just give us a summary of how the process worked. I know you attached some forms about certain topics that people wanted to know more about. And I was just curious how that came about. If you all could just give us a quick summary of the process.
And Mayor, Councilor Villarreal, I'll defer to the chair about the commission's process. And with regards to the forms, we did ask if it would be helpful for us to do some background information on the topics that were expressly requested by the governing body, because there had been discussion by the governing body about some of them. Some of them had been proposed previously, so there was information for us to draw from. So that's what the staff topic sheets were based upon, and those were presented in December of 2022. And then after that, the commission both considered the topics in the resolution as well as additional topics that either came from their own membership or members of the public. Beyond that, I defer to Chair Long and the subcommittee chairs.
Yes, this is Nancy Long. I'm appearing remotely via Zoom at this meeting today, and we're happy to assist the council in understanding our recommendations and reports in any way that we can. Mayor and members of the council, we did consider all of the topics that were posed to us by the council in their resolution, as well as an additional 6. Some, as Ms. McSherry just explained, some came from the commission itself and some came from the public. Public asked that we consider certain items. So there were an additional 6 added on to the 9 that the council sent to us. We considered matters that the commission as a whole voted on. So if there was a proposal that came forward by the public, we did not automatically analyze that or refer it to a committee. Instead, we required that the commission by majority vote make a decision to consider that matter. So that was our process in the topics that we considered. And then we had 2 subcommittees. We started with 3, but we had to reorganize a bit. So we had 2 subcommittees. One we called the governance subcommittee, and I referred matters that seemed in line with the governance issues that were referred to us to that committee. And then we had a human rights subcommittee, and that subcommittee considered the matters that were more in line with the Human Rights Commission consideration, as well as some other matters that went to that committee. The governance committee was chaired by Paul Deerdak. The Human Rights Subcommittee was chaired by Peter Ives. And there was an overlap, I think, of one member that was a member of both of those committees. Those committees would meet in between our meetings and come back with recommendations. At the beginning, it was sort of progress reports, and by the end, it was in the form of recommendations. We would weigh in on that, but we did not vote on all of the recommendations until our last meeting or next to the last meeting. And then at our last meeting, we considered the final report. We received, all of our meetings were either in person in your council chambers or were remote. We did not meet any other place, but we did receive written comments from the public, and we also invited the public to attend the meetings and provide comment either via Zoom or in person. And we received comments in all of those ways. More at the end of the process, more comments were received at the end of the process, I would say, when we had our own portion of the website up, and there was a form that interested parties could fill out on the very specific recommendation item, whether they were in favor of it, if they had any comments about it. It seemed to be a way that the public found easy to make comments. And so we did receive more, I would say, at the end of that process, once that got set up on the city's website. So I hope that explains.
That's
what-
great. Thank you.
What that process was. Oh, and I should also say that we had, great support from the city attorney's office. We had a city attorney assigned to each of the committees, and they would attend those meetings regularly with the committee and also help to provide advice, guidance, and answer questions that committee had, even outside of the committee setting.
Thank you. That's great. Let's just roll along and ask each member of the governing body in turn if they have questions about the report they'd like more details or clarification on. And the clerk will start a clock. We'll try to hold to about 10 minutes per person, not rigid, but try to respect that number so that we don't end up going long into the Quality of Life Committee meeting. So let me start to my right. Councillor Lee Garcia, if you would like, you have the floor, sir. You can raise questions or make a statement, however you want to use your time.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I wanted to thank the committee and everyone who contributed to the process. It seemed like it was a long time, but not very long. It just went by like nothing. And you all seem to make it very easy for us to follow, as well as try to include the community. And I think that is what we try to achieve and to strive for, is to have as much community involvement as possible. And I heard at times it didn't seem like there was a lot of involvement until quite the end. And that at times makes it difficult to really change things. However, as I was going through one of the items, which looks like I printed out the redacted version just to kind of reference a couple of things. And one of the items that caught my eye was on page 6 of that file, and I don't know if that's the same as what's on the what's in the packet or on PrimeGov, but I got this from the website, and it's the recommendations on topics referred to the Santa Fe Charter Commission as governing subcommittee by the City Council 2023, and this one is the one that's redlined or has a redact. Anyway, on page 6 of that, it's item I. It says it's a continuation, well, of the powers of the mayor, and it says shall sign, veto, or allow to become law without signature each ordinance adopted by the council. Signature or veto shall be exercised within 30 days of the ordinance adoption. Can you maybe elaborate on the discussion over that item?
I would ask our governance committee chair, Mr. Deerdak, to comment on that if he is there.
He is. Mr. Mayor, Councilor, I see this. I think we have your version and mine have different page numbers, and so I'm almost certain that I know where you are. I think it's. I think I probably should describe it this way. When we received the referrals from you all, it asked at one point that we consider how the rules in the city structure that was adopted 10 years ago, how that should be perfected in terms of separation of powers. And you use that term in your referral, separation of powers. When we considered that, we realized that powers can't be separated effectively if they are not also balanced. Balancing powers is the flip side of the coin, separating powers. If you do one without the other, you wind up with even more dysfunction than you started with. So we wanted to consider both. And we noticed that in many cities where the mayor and the council are clearly separated as the executive function of government versus the legislative function of government, the way to balance those powers is to determine what the executive in government has the authority to appoint and what the executive in government has the authority to prevent when in executive judgment, meaning think of an executive director. An executive director executes and directs, right? So when one thinks of the executive function in government, we're trying to balance that with the legislative functions of government. And this is one way to do that. We were very mindful, however, we looked at a number of city charters across the country where this function does occur. It's very common. It's a third of the city charters in the United States have this feature. They tend to be the larger cities. And Santa Fe winds up being, at the very lowest end in population, I would say, of that list. And so it's kind of on the cusp between cities who do and don't. But many cities do. And when they do, some of them have detailed provisions about how this is supposed to work that go on for pages. And that's not the way Santa Fe constructs its charter. You have a few sentences on each topic, and beyond that, the council puts its attention to exactly how to structure it, how to facilitate it, how to make it work. Your attorney helps. So we thought that we were a group of lay people who you asked to contemplate all this, and we did, but we also were aware that if indeed this particular provision winds up in your recommendation, you will want to apply yourselves to details that you may think are important, or you may want to adjust that sentence in some way that makes sense to you. But we wanted to put it in the document as a marker that when balancing separated powers, this is a piece of balancing those powers. Counselor, did I respond to your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that response. And I you know, and again, reading this, obviously we do look at it in terms of how do we separate those duties of the primary policymakers and the managers of the city. And this somewhat kind of explains, if I were to just make a recommendation, and again, I go back to the will of the governing body. If anything can be vetoed by the executive or the mayor, then could potentially give absolute power. I would just maybe interject at some point and say, at the point where a supermajority may be the case, then there is no veto.
So if you'll notice in the duties of the council, it describes the fact that the council may override such vetoes.
Okay. Yes, I actually read that. That's all I had for right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor.
Great, thank you. Counselor Cassett,
Thank you so much.
you're on the
Mr. Mayor.
clock.
I'm on the clock. Got it. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for your work and your time and energy into this. I just had a couple of questions that I wanted to hear a little bit more about. Let's actually go back to the separation of powers and that structure, because that was something I am also, I'd been interested in of how we really do this balance a bit more. But sticking with an 8-person council and giving the mayor tie-breaking authority, as well as also the selection of committees coming from the council level. When I think about these things, they seem in this small of a body that is also a nonpartisan body. Whereas, if you look at the legislature, they have party leadership, and a lot of that, will fall to them in terms of some of the assignments. So I was curious how you all contemplated these things, why these were the suggestions. I understand that kind of disrupting the current structure of city council of 4 counselors per district, or 4 districts, 2 counselors per district, seems challenging, especially since we did just go through redistricting. But if you could add any more insight into why this was the structure that you landed upon and recommended.
Thank you, Mayor and councilors. I need to ask you a question about your question. What do you mean when you ask for this particular part of the recommendation? Are you simply asking about either the veto or the assignment of committees? Or are you asking more broadly about how we dealt with the two questions, how many counselors there should be per district and how many districts there should be?
You're right. I did kind of combine questions. So let's back up a little bit. I think they're kind of attached, but you know, the mayor coming in for basically just tie breaking in terms of voting, as well as I understand the veto power, and that makes sense to me. It just feels problematic. With there being an even number of counselors, as you were looking at this in other communities, has this worked well in other places? Has this not worked well? I believe
Thank you.
we've seen communities move away from this, so.
I understand. You may be aware, and I hope you are, that having 2 counselors per district is a rarity. Having 2 counselors per district in a town this small is more rare than that. So we started looking at that. That would change a lot of the dynamics, as I think you've alluded, if that were changed. But when we thought about changing that dynamic, we, in our subcommittee particularly, had several discussions about this. And some of the members of the committee had expertise in this area and shared with us considerations that we found compelling. For instance, when you say to the voting public that each of your districts gets to be represented by 2 people, it's one thing to expand representation. It's a whole different thing to retract it. And the idea that we would go through a successful political process of removing representation from people who have been represented, we thought was, we were reluctant to contemplate such an experience. There was that. The member who was most articulate about this also said that in a city like Santa Fe, where social equity is an issue, and one which we always want to make forward progress about, having more than one representative in a district does give the residents of that district an opportunity to elect somebody for the sake of the majority. And when the minority in that district wants further representation, not to leave them out, but to give them an opportunity to have somebody else. And so that ethical discussion about the unique benefits in Santa Fe of having 2 counselors per district, we found compelling. Then when you begin to see how this works as you have in practice, in breaking a tie, for instance, how do cities that have a mayor who's a non-voting member, except for breaking the ties, how can that even be done? Some people asked, is that even feasible? Well, it turns out there's lots of ways. We mentioned 3. There are others. If you'll notice in the commentary, in this section, there's a long commentary. We mentioned 3 possible ways to break a tie. What if you had a standing rule among yourselves that on the occasion of a tie, the matter automatically goes to goes on the table, and the last item in every agenda is any items on the table need to come off the table for the purpose of breaking the tie. The mayor is simply on call from wherever he is or she is, and she knows that in fact the meeting will end at roughly such and such a time, and she may get a phone call. And when that happens, there is an adjourned session and the tie gets broken. You folks know the ins and outs of these details a lot better than we do. But we just imagined that there are ways to do this administratively. And that, but we in every one of our discussions, we made very certain that we began with a discussion of how do our values affect the structure we're discussing. And we started with a discussion of values and changing the way districts and the number of counselors are elected in Santa Fe seemed to us on the issue of values, disrupting it is more harmful than any perceived weaknesses that we might keep. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I think I believe you did. Just to follow up, when you were looking at other cities that do have this kind of model with a mayor only coming in to break a tie, did you notice any of the challenges that they had? You know, what are some of the things that we would really need to think about? What are some of the downfalls, not just in the administrative and procedural process, but how this looks politically, if it really changed the policymaking process, or if you saw pros and cons of how this might work?
Thank you. Yes. More work could be done on that, I suppose, but there is another piece I can. Right now, you have 8 counselors with 1 person who has some other title. And yeah, and so you get 5 to 4 decisions now. And when you have a 5 to 4 decision, somebody up on that dais is breaking the tie already. So would this change that dynamic? Very much.
Thank you. I also saw a budget coming from the city manager as opposed to the mayor, and would like to hear more about your philosophy around that change.
Thank you very much. Indeed. You heard what I said at the outset, that we were separating and balancing powers between executive functions and legislative functions. If you notice, the Model City Charter has quite a bit of discussion about what happens when the distinction between the mayoral and the managerial function are blurred, or when there's no distinction at all, or when the public is confused as to who is what. In our document, we tried to institutionalize the notion that the executive function is one function, embodied by 2 roles with 2 different job descriptions, and it needs to be 2 different people. In fact, there's quite a discussion in the model about places where, again, as I said, that they have been blurred, and cases where a mayor who does too much city managing winds up doing too little as mayor. And that has become a major problem in some cities. That may not be our problem, but there are cities that are in crisis over wanting to fix that. So we made a particular point of recommending to you that the city manager be the one who convenes department heads, works with department heads, develops budgets, and brings those budgets to you for detailed discussion and adoption. One of the functions of legislators is rulemaking, budgets, and oversight. That's American civics. And so the budgetary purpose is a huge part of what you do. You need to have your city talk to you about its detailed financial matters through a budgetary process. And it seemed to us that the city manager is the right person to carry that load.
Thank you. Yeah, I do appreciate that. I know that that has been a topic of, well, we just got through budget hearings. So of course it's been a large topic of conversation about the process of the budget. So do appreciate you weighing in. I'm going to guess I'm getting out of time. So one last question. I did have a member of the community state that they felt that the recommended changes made the mayor too weak. And so I'd be curious your thoughts on that and those conversations. And do you agree with this, or how do you feel that it was really balanced between the 2?
Notice the paragraph in the commentary in which we answer the question, what is meant by a mayoral message, and how do we how do we figure that the mayor delivers a message on matters of importance? What's the meaning of the word importance? And we thought that the charter should not describe what's important and what isn't important. That's what happens in elections. And a candidate who can articulate what's important to the satisfaction of the voters will be the mayor, because the voters will elect that mayor. And so we were rather clear that a position of political authority needs to be defined in a constitutional document as little as possible to give that person the freedom to lead. And that exercise of that obligation, responsibility, and right conferred by the electorate needs to have a free field to run. And that is one consequence of separating and balancing powers, is to have a mayoral authority. And so we did not constrain it.
Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate it. I will yield the floor, and because I'm assuming I'm.
Okay, and there may well be time for some follow-ups. And I just think if we can everybody get through the first round, we'll be all better off. Councilor Mayorworth.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I want to thank the members of the Charter Review Commission and, of course, the chair and the committee chairs. Having served on this, and I think my colleagues all know that I was part of this commission 10 years ago, and I know how much work it is, and I think it is an important exercise that we do roughly every 10 years to take a look at how things are working and look at other cities and other structures and evaluate essentially what we're doing and where we might want to make changes. And I think there's some good suggestions here. I think a lot of them need more work. And I guess I'm a little bit concerned, and I want to refer to the Thornburg Foundation background memo and comments. And in it, on page 5, they caution, and I believe this, just for everybody to know, this memo was done, I believe, by somebody at UNM, Timothy Krebs Research and Consulting LLC, and I think
Hang on
it's
one
from UNM.
And Mayor Weber, councilors, I would just want to make sure that that memo was not background to the commission's work. It came in after the commission finished its work. Just to make sure everyone knows that who's hearing this conversation.
And it was distributed to the
Correct.
governing body previously.
I sent it out this weekend. Correct. Yeah.
Okay, and it's in the packet for the public, correct?
Mayor Weber, councilors, the only thing in the packet is, I mean, it's certainly available if public wishes to have it, but it really wasn't anything that resulted in the board's recommendations. The board made its recommendations and then we received this feedback. So it's certainly for your information, but it did not impact the recommendations of the commission because they did not have it. It didn't exist before.
Well, that's fine, but can't I ask about what they say? I mean, it's like public comment, right? I
Mayor,
mean, what they're saying versus what the commission was thinking?
Mayor Weber, councilors, you can absolutely, I think, make reference to it. I would guess what I would say is the commission didn't have it in making their recommendations. So their recommendations will not reflect any thought process that relates to that analysis, if that makes sense. So these folks won't be able to answer questions
Okay,
about that analysis in relation to their commission work.
all right,
The commission disbanded before that document existed.
okay.
If that makes sense.
Yep. So I won't ask you to comment since you can't speak for your group. But I will note that it does emphasize a concern I have, which is that we are giving, under this proposal, both legislative function and executive function to the mayor. So we're saying the mayor can break a tie as part of the governing body, which I would see as a legislative function, and then can in addition veto a piece of legislation which I would see as typically an executive function. And this comes from the problem that we have our mayor sitting as part of the governing body. And we weren't able 10 years ago to make the executive a true executive and the legislative a true legislative. We have this funny blend because the mayor sits as part of the governing body and also now votes, but does not have a veto under our current system. So in giving the mayor the ability to break a tie and veto, to me, that's confusing. And I believe that the Thornburg Foundation memo by the Krebs Research and Consulting cautions about that. And so I would just draw some attention to that.
And Mayor,
don't-
if I could, Counselor, comment on that as well.
Sure.
You know, you weren't asking a question, but I will say that the commission struggled at many meetings with the issue of, you know, how does this tie breaking work? And because we have an even number of counselors without the mayor, it is a problem. I think it is a problem. We recognized it as a problem. We recognized also that you all may have some additional ideas, resources, or ways in which you could resolve that problem. But it is an issue. And if we had come forward with a recommendation on redistricting and maybe having one counselor per district, shrinking the number of districts maybe to 5, we did talk about that with one counselor per district, then we wouldn't have that problem. But for all the reasons that Paul Dierdak mentioned, we thought it would be too disruptive. We thought it would not be well received by voters. And so those two things did not mesh. I would just want to caution against calling us any sort or categorizing us as any sort of a governing label for our city. You will see in that Thornburg Foundation memo from Mr. Krebs, he talks about the counselor manager, about the mayor council. Those terms are used in the model city charter. And, you know, Mr. Krebs does acknowledge, I don't think strongly enough, that we don't fit into either one. We are really a custom done city. We are a hybrid at a minimum. And so I think the model charter is instructive and very helpful on some of its language, but we do not fit into those labels for our city, if that's makes sense. We really are very different. So I want you to know that we did struggle with that issue of the mayor voting the tie, not just because it leads into a legislative function, but just mechanically how that would work. We did have a lot of questions about, and we did not have all the answers.
Thank you. I appreciate that background and that drawing out. And I would note on page 1 of the memo, Mr. Krebs does say, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, it is hard to categorize Santa Fe's form of government because it does not fit neatly into the typical forms of government found in the U.S. cities. Some refer to it as a strong mayor system, but that's not exactly right. That Santa Fe's system of government has evolved the way it has is consistent, however, with trends seen in the U.S. over the last 30 years or so. And these changes have sought to address the main deficiencies in both major categories of city government's form. So, yeah, and you mentioned the number of counselors, and to me, it seems like, if we want to make the executive a true executive, give the executive veto power, take the executive off of this body, make this body a true legislative body, it seems to me that we do need to do a redistricting process, and we need an odd number of counselors, whether that be 5 or 7 or see. You know, or some other, I mean, I'm not sure I want to, and given that, and then of course you got to look at the size of the city. And I know that is a debate all by itself, right? Is how many counselors there should be. And if you had one counselor per district, how would that work? So these are some of the examples of things that I think, while this was a good exercise in beginning to think about these things, I think there's more that needs to be done. I'm also a little bit concerned, I believe, Mr. Deerdak, you mentioned, and just piggybacking on this idea of the budget coming from the city manager. And you suggested that, you know, I think your exact words were something to the effect of the mayor can't lead if they can't set the policy priorities, something. I think that's what I heard from you. And yet, if you can't fund the policy priorities and develop the budget in line with your policy priorities, I see that as problematic. So I see a budget coming from the city manager as problematic. And I think also the Thornburg memo also suggests something to that, and I'm not going to be able to find it, and I'm sure I'm almost out of time for this round. So maybe I'll look for it if we get another chance. But, you know, suggesting that I'm sorry, I should have marked that. But I don't know if you want to comment on that at all, or, you know, I think the, you know, yeah, I don't know. Do you want to comment on that?
Thank you, I will. It did not occur to us that we would have a mayor leading in one direction and a city manager leading in another. They are part of the same executive.
Do you remember the cost administration?
Not very well.
First city manager, maybe go back to that history. Sorry.
Thank you.
That's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Much appreciated. That was good. Counselor Lindell, you had the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. By the way, Counselor, I remember. I just have a couple of questions, and let me try to make them like examples of. So it's really a question. Am I understanding that the mayor would not be an active voting member of the governing body? Pardon?
You got to go to the mic, sir. Otherwise you're off the record.
So what I'm coming up with is if someone proposed some legislation in order for it to get passed with an 8-member council, they would have to have 5 votes. That's hard to do. And then even if they got 5 votes, then the mayor could veto it, correct?
Yes.
And then it would take a supermajority to override the veto, which would be 6-2, correct?
Also correct.
That, in my mind, brings a screeching halt to an awful lot of legislation. And I think that I think it would be very, very hard for a council to get things done under that kind of policies, procedures, paradigm, almost impossible for things to get done. A 6-2 vote is very, very hard. I don't see if a council votes something through at 5-3, which is hard enough, it would surely be hard to pick up another vote from that council. So for me, this really is not particularly workable, because I think it'll bring an absolute screeching halt to getting legislation brought forward and in fact passed. And what it would do, in my mind, is to give the mayor the mayor would be a superpower then. If they veto, it's highly unlikely that that veto gets overturned. So it gives the mayor an astounding amount of power. So those are my comments in the first round. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilwoman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you all for your service and the work you did with the commission. I think that given the time, you were trying to make the best recommendations. I will say as my opinion that I think your time was too limited. You can't come up with pros and cons and structures and looking at other models when you have a very condensed amount of time, which doesn't even allow for like a public input kind of scenario where you can actually have community engagement meetings to have the public weigh in and just help people understand actually the structure that we're in now. I don't think many people even know what we have now and how that's different from a few years ago. And then some of the suggestions, what that would look like, even, what's happening in Albuquerque now, they're proposing changes to limit the power of their mayor. And so I guess I would have liked to see more time for you all to do your work that wasn't so compressed. Because what I'm seeing here is like little, not little, but attempts to try to make recommendations on issues that are really complex. So you're trying to dissect things with a very busy commission. Everybody, for the most part, was very full-time with other jobs. And so that always, I mean, the product here is kind of what I see as the reason for it, for that compressed amount of time. And I appreciate that staff jumped in to try to answer questions, give legal advice. But what I see here is giving me not a very clear picture of like how to move forward. One thing I really need to understand, and maybe I'm the only one that didn't understand it, but the structure you all gave us as to the recommendations, it was hard for me to determine what were new language recommendations and what were actually existing, what was already existing in our charter. It's kind of a mix that you added in there. Some stuff already exists, some stuff was new. And the way it was framed was like, all of this is new, the way the document is set up. So can maybe someone just explain the structure of the charter amendment recommendations? Because I think there's a mix, unless I'm wrong, but there was a mix of what's already existing and then these new recommendations of structures and models. So I don't know who could explain that to me, because I had a hard time distinguishing. All right, well, and then I was thinking, if I have a hard time distinguishing this, the public is certainly going to have a hard time, because we see the charter and not everybody knows what's in the current charter now. So could you just walk us through what is, not all of these are all your recommendations, and some of them are. So maybe y'all could just help us move through that, or just explain for me, I guess.
I think going through it line by line and answering your question, because many sentences are a mix of the sentence that already exists with some important changes
Right,
in a parenthetical phrase or a word.
right.
So
Well, if I can jump in, I understand exactly what Councilwoman Villalobos concerning. I think it was because of our, I'm sorry, my dog here in the.
We hear you kind of choppy right now, but now we don't hear you at all. Oh, wait, now you're muted. Oh, wait, no.
We had a very short period of time to put our report together in the end. And so you are correct. And going through the report before I presented to the council, I had to go through and mark each provision as already existing or new. So what I think the governance subcommittee, and Paul can speak to this, was doing was taking the entire section in the charter as it exists and just republishing it, basically. Some things were new, some were already existing. And there just wasn't the time to have a report that highlighted what the changes were. So that certainly could be prepared.
Yeah, I think it actually needs to be prepared. And, you know, we do red lines. They're not fun, but it helps to kind of see this is what it used to say. This is what we kind of tweak. This is brand new language. Or even, I don't know. I was just trying to think about structures of explanation. So the general public could understand, and then also counselors that don't read the charter all the time. We don't read it every single day. So just to kind of understand that, it would have helped me personally to really understand, because you all gave an analysis of like some of the rationale around some of your changes, but some stuff I'm like, well, was that language that was originally here? So I got myself like looking at the original charter and this, and then I just like, it was very frustrating. So I don't know if there were comments on that.
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, counselors. Pat did help with the report, and I'm very thankful that she was in town the week that I was out of the country when they made the final recommendations. So the report was based on those final recommendations. Depending on what the council is interested in pursuing, we would absolutely create a red line. There was not time to do it before the report was released. And in order to conserve staff resources, I would like to do it for ones that the council is interested in, not just all of them across the board, unless we know you're pursuing them all.
Okay. And I guess that's that leads to my other question, is about if there were, I mean, some of this was kind of wordsmithing changes and some were substantial structural changes. And so what could we change through just a resolution to clean up language, and what actually needs to be put on as a ballot measure? I think that's where I was also confused, like, and there were also recommendations that I don't think need to be on as a charter ballot measure, put it on the ballot to make that change. One in particular was the, Human Rights Commission, and maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, counselors, certainly some of them could be done by ordinance. Absolutely. I'm not sure if any could be done by resolution. Possibly. I mean, if it's so maybe the equity one could be resolution. That's not, it just depends on what authority they have or don't have, or if they're administrative versus having authority over the public. So when you mentioned what requires a resolution, so if you are amending the charter in any way, really, I think we need a resolution and a ballot question. If it's, so like if you're changing existing language in the existing charter, we would need a resolution and a ballot question. If it's new ideas that could be addressed through either a resolution or an ordinance, then it doesn't necessarily require, then it does not require a charter amendment. But we'd really have to go through what idea is it. Veto power absolutely requires a charter amendment. That does not exist now, and it would be a new power of the mayor. Some of the other ones in the recommendation that I don't think we've necessarily gotten to yet don't necessarily require a charter amendment. So for example, equity and inclusion, certain things related to Human Rights Commission. If you were going to give Human Rights Commission power over outside entities, which the Human Rights Commission of the state does have, and we would have to look at that and analyze the authority that the city could have in something like that, then I think that definitely would have to at least be in an ordinance, because it would need to be a new law. It's not clear it has to be in the charter. We do have a human rights policy in the charter currently. So if you wanted to expand that policy, we would need to write that into the charter if you want it to have the same force of law that the current policy has.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would have helped me to, like, what could be, not all of this would be a ballot measure. What would be a ballot measure? What would be an ordinance? What could be something we could do by resolution?
And Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Villarreal. I think some of the folks here might be able to talk a little bit about, there were some categories of recommendations that did fall outside a recommendation for the charter itself, that are in the report. They were ideas that were considered by the commission. So the commission did distinguish between those in terms of their recommendations. But their recommendations are not necessarily hinged upon what has to be in the charter to have the force of law or to accomplish what they're recommending versus things that could go elsewhere. Those were some of the things that we talked about is, does the particular thing have to be in the charter? And sometimes that wasn't the basis necessarily for the recommendation that it go in the charter. And I would defer to the commission on commenting about that.
I think I would like to hear from Councilor Ives specifically about the Human Rights Commission and why you felt that was a ballot measure or charter change versus, let's say, like an ordinance.
Thank you, first of all, for that question. And members of the council, let me first say that on behalf of myself and certainly all the other commissioners who served, it was with a great sense of privilege and pride in our city that we were selected to work on these proposed amendments. We certainly did it in the context recognizing the significance of the process we were engaged in. And I can certainly affirm, and it's certainly reflected in the changes you have before you, that we recommend changes to how the Charter Commission itself is structured in the future, especially with regards to the time that is given to the commission to accomplish those purposes. With regards to the Human Rights Commission, that was an item that came up, was raised by one of the members of the Human Rights and Social Issues Committee that I was chair of. And it was the sense that, especially given, and mind you, I think at about the same time we were bringing that forward was that point in time that the council had brought forth its proposal for the Equity and Inclusion Office. The sense of the committee and ultimately the sense of the commission was that human rights in the world we currently live in have become such significant issues. If you read the paper this morning, Governor DeSantis sending migrants from El Paso to Deming to be flown to Sacramento, evidences the significance of these issues within our contentious society. And it was ultimately the sense, certainly of the committee, that the notion of having a Human Rights Commission was something that it would be good for the populace, for the citizenry of Santa Fe to weigh in on, that this was something that was so fundamental to how we think about our city, how we think about what we do here. And certainly those counselors who have served through many of the sanctuary, the adoption of the sanctuary resolutions and changing city policies to reflect those. I know you are totally aware of the significance of those issues. So this was more, not some, and indeed, if you look at the recommendation, it actually suggests that having an office of equity and inclusion or something similar within the city context itself would certainly make sense, because it does need, an enforcement aspect within the city. But having a Human Rights Commission and having the people of Santa Fe weigh in on the establishment of that as a protection for human rights across the city was simply seen as significant enough to give the opportunity for the people of Santa Fe to weigh in on. So.
Got it. Thank you for that explanation. And yeah, I think the idea of the Human Rights Commission is a good one. And I don't know if you heard my commentary from the last council meeting when I was trying to understand how we then inform the public about anything that goes onto the as a ballot measure. And who's in charge of the education around it? Who gets to explain it to the public and why it's important? And that piece I worry about because I don't know about if the capacity is there and something so important to put on a ballot. Who does the education around it? We haven't defined that right now. Even if there's an item that some of us want to go on a ballot, on the ballot, and maybe other counselors don't agree about it, then I guess I'm just curious about the process. And we've talked about this with staff because then if there's not the will to educate the public about an item on the ballot, that I think weakens it because then people don't know what they're voting for. And so that is a big concern of mine that's still lingering because I don't understand how that gets prioritized. So that's not for you to answer necessarily, but this is a concern if anything makes it onto the ballot, what gets prioritized and who's educating the public around those topics that get placed on there. So there's that. And I know I have a limited time, so I want to ask you all about your process of considering full-time counselors and the deliberation on that. And ultimately you indicated that doesn't make sense based on the size of our population. Maybe it's even the numbers that we have on the council, but I'm just curious if you could give us some more information about that.
Let me actually turn to Commissioner Deerdak as the governance committee took that up in the first instance and had the most significant discussions on that particular topic, but happy to weigh in at the end if need be.
Thank you, Counselor. I mentioned already one aspect of that, and it was a long discussion of many iterations. We would adjourn a meeting and come back 2 weeks later and talk about it again. So it is true that the number of counselors matters, and it's true that there are lots of arguments in favor of a smaller city council, and there are many arguments against reducing a council that already has become habit forming in a city. So that's a tough one. Furthermore, I think you may be aware that in New Mexico, there are actual legal restrictions as to how big a council can be, and Santa Fe is getting to the upper limit. If the census shows, and the census moves, I think you know better than we do, by annexation as well as by influx. But if the census shows the kind of movement it's been showing lately, you could cross the threshold of 100,000 sometime. And if you did, it would likely be in the coming decade. So the next census might get you there or not. And it would be a lot more palatable to the public, we think, when that happens, to show 5 districts with either 1 or 2. Well, that'd be a tough one going down to 1, but it'd be a lot easier to show that as the arithmetic function of having crossed that threshold. Having kept within this rough size of 80,000 and then increasing the number of districts even within that number seems to us to be just a bridge too far. But you're right. We did not bring a whole lot of science. We brought a whole lot of gut reaction to just what these numbers mean and how they would mean to the voters that we are so very familiar with. So no more sophisticated than that, Council.
And if I could just add, there was the recommendation that that staff be hired for counselors at this time, even though they would not be full-time, but there would be full-time staff. Not as part of a charter amendment, but as a recommendation that the council may want to consider.
Thank you. And maybe you could just answer a question. Was there discussion about the governance inequities of power as we have right now are a hybrid. Did you talk about that? The fact that we're part-time counselors, we have a full-time mayor that hires and fires 3 staff that's integral to our work as well as counselors.
We talked about a version of that. And that was that having going from part-time to full-time would be a huge hike in cost. And that will be justifiable when we're dealing with a different size city. And then you referred, Counselor, to the inequities that exist at this moment. The place where that conversation came up was in response to something that on your July 27th meeting was brought up by Counselor Cassett, who described the difference between those counselors who are elected in the same year as the mayor versus those counselors who are elected in the year that the mayor is not being elected. And that creates an inequity in these 2 classes of council. So we did not see a way to cure that unless you start from the beginning and restructure the body entirely. And that's a heavy lift. That's a big one.
Thank you. And then last, because I think I have time, is if there's these recommendations, is there a possibility, this is for staff, to consider them not in just this election, but in future elections, municipal elections?
Mayor Weber, councilors, a ballot question actually could be put on any election ballot. And it could even be the basis for a special election if the governing body wanted to pursue something like that. So there's no limitations. There's just a minimum requirement that we convene this commission once every decade and have them make a full recommendation. But at any time outside of those dates, the governing body could propose legislation to put a ballot question to the public.
Okay. And could there be a resolution from council to pick up the work of the commission, the charter commission, to maybe take more time to start analyzing some of these suggestions?
Mayor Weber, councilors, I think so. I think our charter says at least, so it doesn't limit the times that a charter commission could meet as well.
Okay, so they could reconvene if we decided through resolution that we want them to continue their work,
Mayor Weber, Councilor Villarreal, yes.
if they choose to.
Yes. So Mayor Weber, Councilor, I would say that you would need to establish the membership again, because the membership of the existing or the commission that made these recommendations, basically we ended it at May 10th. So you could establish, it could be of any form. And whether these folks would be the same people, I think would depend on how you establish membership and if they were appointed again and all of that.
And was May 10th a deadline that you all picked? Maybe you could just share how that was picked.
Mayor Weber, councilors, that was in the resolution that the governing body adopted. And it was based on providing the governing body enough time to make recommendations by the deadline by the county clerk, which is August 29th. And the last governing body meeting before August 29th under your current calendar, and I will send this timeline out, is August 9th. Obviously, there could be special meetings if that were desired or things like that. But under the regular calendar, you would need to adopt legislation with ballot questions by August 9th, which gives you, working backwards with the committee schedule and everything else, that doesn't give much time from today.
Till next week, which we'll talk about later.
July, probably, yeah.
Thank you.
And
Garcia.
Mayor, Councilwoman, I do really appreciate your comments about our condensed schedule and our reduced time to consider some really weighty issues. By the time we got organized and we're meeting regularly, that was January. So we really only had 4 months. And clearly that's probably an insufficient amount of time. So I do appreciate your insight into that.
Councilor Garcia, you have it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you to the commissioners present, Commissioner Deardack, Commissioner Ives, Chair Long. Thank you to staff for all the time and effort on this. I know it was a huge lift I remember when we were going over the resolution and debating the laundry list of items for y'all to go over, I knew it was a lot in a short amount of time. So I believe one of your recommendations is to really review and look at this process, and I wholeheartedly support this. I think it's one of those we've got to provide sufficient time, but not only time, resources. I think we need to provide fiscal resources for folks to convene the community and ensure that we are doing everything we can to encourage the public to participate in this very critical process. So I think there's 7 ultimate recommendations put forth by the commission. Am I correct in that understanding? 6, 7.
Mayor Weber, councilors, it's described as 6 in the summary on the front page.
Okay,
I think some of them have multiple parts, so
right.
look at them in various ways.
And so my thought is that given that we put forth the request to the commission did their time, effort, energy, due diligence to put forth the recommendations to us, I believe it's our responsibility to then have 6 separate resolutions going over these recommendations. And then we can have ample time to review, debate, discuss, amend, or vote down, vote up. That's my suggestion, that we move forward in that process. I don't know if any of the other counselors are willing, but I'm willing to sponsor each and every one of these proposals individually. That way, there might be some where a counselor agrees, but they might not agree in another one, and it allows us to support an individual item versus have to thumb up or thumb down a package. I think that's just, again, the responsibility we have to the commission based off of their time, energy, and effort. I've got one question around the recommendations for the restructuring of the council mayor manager duties. And I'm going to go to page 3. And I think so. This might be for Commissioner Deardack, the question. So on page 3, item F is Mayor Pro Tempore. And it's recommending that the mayor appoint the mayor pro tem, whereas in our city code, the city council is to elect the mayor pro tem. And I think my concern there is it just extends a bit of the authority of the mayor over the legislative. So if you can give me, maybe help me understand, why are we diverting from current practice?
Yes, thank you, Counselor. This was a matter that there are plenty of good arguments on both sides of it, and you should bounce the way you want to. And this is a glaring case in which a one sentence alteration of our recommendation was, you should use good judgment about that, like you should in all cases. But the idea that this whole structural document rises or falls as a whole, that never crossed our mind. This can be amended sentence by sentence to any extent you prefer. The particular matter that you raise, it's interesting because our understanding of the pro tem is that the pro tem acts on behalf of the elected who is absent, who is circumstantially absent at the moment. And so it seemed to us part of the extension of that executive's desire to control how executive functions happen, to which she were elected, makes a lot of sense to us that person should engage in the selection of that person. Could you do it the other way? Of course. And we also noted that in this structure, the council would select its presiding officer. And we said at one point that if that's the same person, fine. Doesn't have to be. So your insight about this is exactly, it reflects like one of the conversations that I remember very clearly from one of our committees.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner.
And just to clarify, if I may, Counselor and Paul, and I think it goes back to Councilwoman Villarreal's comments about the structure of the report that is certainly confusing, but we did, as a commission, did not change this provision regarding the mayor pro tem. The mayor pro tem is still appointed by the mayor as occurs now. It is just that you would have, under the recommendations, the council would choose a presiding officer, which may or may not also be the mayor pro tem. So the only language that was added is at the very end of that paragraph, with the sentence that says the mayor pro tempore shall perform the duties of the mayor in the absence or temporary incapacity of the mayor. And then it was added and continue as a member of the council. So it was clear that they are a counselor, they maintain that membership on the council. So I just wanted to add that clarification in our recommendations.
Thank you, Chair.
Mayor, Councilor Garcia, I would just add that that section is 5.04 in the charter, and that section of the charter isn't addressed in the report. And that section of the charter says at the first meeting of the council following a regular city election, the mayor shall appoint, subject to the approval of the council, a councillor to serve as mayor pro tempore until the next regular city election. And then goes on to say the mayor pro tempore shall perform the duties of the mayor in the absence or temporary incapacity of the mayor.
Thank you for the clarification. I think then we have some conflicting laws before us, because if we look at our city code 2-1.8, election of mayor pro tem, it states the mayor of the members of the city council shall at the first meeting after the election elect from their own body a mayor pro tem to act in the absence of the mayor, except as may otherwise be provided by law or ordinance. So I think we might need to clean that up. Just so
Mayor, councilors, we absolutely need a cleanup bill for various sections of Chapter 2 administration that have not been updated since the last charter amendment.
Thank you for all that clarification. I appreciate it. I guess maybe a question for staff, since we got an email on Saturday regarding the Thornburg report that was, or memo that was issued. Was there any additional information issued by the public in regards to their commentary on the Charter Review Commission, whether it be newspapers, media outlets, blogs, any other commentary, such as something that could be considered, such as the Thornburg report that was produced to us?
Mayor, councilors, the only public comment that we received that I'm aware of, I put into the consolidated document that I sent to you. I did not consolidate newspaper articles or editorials. They are public. If they exist, they are out there, I guess.
Well, I just want to be consistent, because if it's out there, then so is the Thornburg. And I think we want to be fair in regards to the information we're digesting as we're going through this process.
Mayor, councilors, I have given you everything I have that is something that was sent to the city.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess I'll just make a couple closing comments in regards to some of the proposals. I'm thankful for all the time, energy, and effort. I think the 7 recommendations, I think they're strong. In particular, the due process recommendation in regards to the quasi judicial process. This has been a problem, at least since I've been on council 4 years. It puts us in the council members in a very challenging situation, especially when matters come before us where constituents want to reach out and we've got to be isolated, and it's not fair for either. So I'm thankful for that recommendation. The budget recommendations, I might have a differing opinion than some of my colleagues. I think what's proposed can work. It works in other avenues, whether it be, the federal process. You've got federal process. President proposes his budget. Congress takes it into consideration. They can adopt it as is, or which never happens. They chop it up and make their own budget. I think that's kind of what's proposed here in the sense that the city manager takes it, gives us a budget, and there are now the additional flexibilities where we can increase or decrease the budget, which, at least from my understanding, we've only been able to decrease budget through amendments, not necessarily increase it, which allows for kind of that policy priority position, as mentioned earlier, in regards to how does the council implement its policy priorities. I think as we move forward with this process, it'd be good to know, and I think maybe if this is what we're talking about in the next topic, how we're going to move forward with this, because like I said, I'm happy to introduce 7 or 6 separate resolutions to move forward. I know we've got an additional one that myself and a couple of colleagues are looking at introducing. But I think this is our time, given we're all here in a public space, and this is our only opportunity to really speak amongst each other to say, yes, we are going to do X, Y, and Z, versus kind of waiting to see who introduces what. I would be very interested in that. So with that, no other questions, but again, thank you, commissioners. I know you spent a lot of time and lots of crunch time. I mean, I really appreciate, I watched some of those last meetings, and you tried to really squeeze 30 hours out of 24-hour day, and you definitely try to do the best on behalf of the public. So thank you all. And thank you, Chair Long, for being with us from a distance. No other questions, Mr. Mayor.
Great, thanks. Councilor Rivera.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to start by thanking all the commission members as well. I know it takes a lot of work and effort, and you didn't have a lot of time. That's the difficult part in this. So want to thank you for everything you've done in your service to the city and your service to the community. It's much appreciated. My first question was for staff, I believe. On page 3, item G, it says the city council shall by ordinance fix the annual salaries of municipal judge and counselors. Is that allowed by law? I thought legislature made council salaries and the judiciary set the salary for the municipal judge.
Mayor Weber, councilors, that is existing language, and we do have an ordinance, and we have established counselor pay. We've tied it to county commissioner pay for Class A counties. We could modify that by ordinance currently, and the judicial officer pay, the municipal judge, is set also by ordinance, and we've established her salary as 90% of a district court judge. And then, so it does get changed. So both of them do change without the governing body needing to act, but they are set by ordinance. So it could be changed.
Can I add to that, Counselor?
Sure.
In addition, City Attorney, those are state statutes, and the legislature determines what a Class A county commissioner makes, and then we tie to that. So it would be the legislature that would have to change the county commission salary for Class A counties, and then our ordinance connects to that. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Mayor Weber, councilors, that is how it currently is established. But if you change your ordinance to not tie it to the state statute, then it would no longer be established by the state.
Right. So I just wanted to make sure we got that addition in there. So it's not just that we have an ordinance, it's that the state sets those county commission, Class A county salaries, and then we say city councilors should be paid the same by ordinance as Class A county commissioners.
Mayor Weber, councilor, that's correct.
All right, thank you. Mr. Durdek, on item I, it says the city council shall by ordinance set a policy for reimbursement of actual and necessary expenses of the mayor, judge, and councilors. What was the thought process with that?
I believe we moved that paragraph from the existing text verbatim. Aaron, do you agree?
Mayor Weber, councilor, I'm looking it up.
Yes, my notes indicate that that is the same as in the existing. charter. It just got reprinted.
Member Council, that's entirely possible. I'm just trying to find it. I mean, part of the complication with doing a red line is things weren't in the same order or things like that, or different words were being used. So, does anyone remember where that was?
It is 602 E. 6.02,
Yes. Okay.
Article 6, the governing body.
Mayor Weber, Chair Long, yes, I see that. That's in the existing charter.
All right, thank you. I think that's some of the difficulty that Councilwoman Villarreal was talking about, and some of these being existing and some not, so. What is in current charter about removing the city clerk, the city attorney, or the city manager?
Mayor Weber, councilors, removal of the city clerk and the city attorney, I believe, is only by the mayor. The manager is either the mayor or a supermajority of the council. And that's one of the amendments from the last kind of major update to the charter was the supermajority portion.
All right, so it can be done, so the clerk or the attorney can be at the discretion of the mayor, but the manager is either or.
Mayor Weber, Councilor Rivera, that's correct. And that's in section 8.04 for the city manager. And that says that a vote of 6 councilors at a regularly scheduled meeting.
I think my next question is for Councilor Ives, and I think Mr. Deerdak alluded to it, but he said a lot of what was in here, or some of what was in here, was gut reaction versus research. And I believe it was your committee that was making suggestions to changes to the Charter Commission and how long it's established. Did you discuss timeframes about how much time would be needed to actually do significant research versus gut feeling type things?
The effort was to find a reasonable estimate of balancing not only the time during which the commission would have, and I apologize, but members of the council and Mr. Mayor, balancing the time frame available to the commission to do that work with also budgetary backing and capacity within city staff to provide research and background information for the commission. So the proposal that's before you, which is on page find that because I can reference it.
17.
Yes, 17 indeed. So it's a new draft, section 10.01. That is a substantial rewrite of the existing 10.01. And it tries to go into some detail saying that the commission should be appointed essentially for a year prior to June, when their final report would be due to the council in order that the council would have sufficient time before presumably an August date in which to determine what was going to be going on a ballot and in what form. So yes, meeting for a year, but then also having sufficient resources to actually conduct. As we were performing the work, several staffers who had been appointed to work with the commission left the city's employ. So it was a bit of a scramble at times. And I know Erin probably took the brunt of that in her office in terms of trying to make sure we were taken care of adequately. And we were all very appreciative of the job done by the city attorney's office. But it was challenging timeframes.
Do you have an idea of how much staff would be required to?
In this proposal, we had suggested that 2 staff be assigned. And we also proposed that at least 2 meetings be held within the first 4 months in each of the council districts so that there is an opportunity to engage the citizens across all of Santa Fe in each district in this conversation in order to not only get their input on existing proposals, but also to secure any additional proposals to be made to the commission, which of course occurred in this instance, as was set forth in the resolution by the governing body that created the commission that has just finished serving. So we thought, and the budget would have to be assessed. We did discuss specific budget amounts, but folks were uncomfortable with that, recognizing that depending on the budget in any particular year, it's going to be challenging to say thou shalt put this much money aside. But so we left it saying that the budget shall be adequate for the commission to accomplish its purposes, basically.
All right, thank you. With regards to, I think Mr. Deerdeck said this, but really the budget from the mayor through the city manager, and that relationship being such so that whatever the mayor wanted to put within the budget, the city manager would have to do because of that relationship that they have. Was there any discussion about having priorities from the governing body or the city council weigh into any budget decisions from the city manager?
Certainly that is considered, and especially against the recognition that no budget is going to move forward until the governing body, or if it's the council in the future, makes that determination. I do recall during my service as a city councilor, we brought forth a measure during Mayor Gonzalez's administration that would require him, the mayor's office, to bring forth the budget at approximately the beginning of February so that it could go to the finance committee and go through its process of evaluating it. The finance committee consideration was, of course, kept within the amendments that have been proposed here because that seemed a very valuable mechanism. And I know it's one that the council and the governing body has engaged in extensively over the course of time. So, and I certainly can say that as in my time as chair of Public Works, we're attempting to get different departments in to look at capital improvement budgets over the course of time so that there was, again, participation by councilors in helping to form that budget, both pre-final budget consideration, but then again, as all of you know, having recently been through the process, and you have that opportunity to weigh in. Some of it, whether or not that time frame can be changed so that it provides greater opportunity for the council to weigh in. Certainly that's something that can be considered, but the proposed amendments call upon the city manager to consider the various goals and objectives as laid forth in the mayor's legislative recommendations, but also the city council's recommendations. So I believe it's built into that process, and it's really then a question for observing the process on a going forward basis.
Thank you. Mr. Deerdeck, did your commission talk about that at all?
Commissioner Ives has reflected our full conversation both ways, absolutely. And the answer is yes, what he said.
Thank you. And, I do agree with some of the changes that were made here, I think, and I joke with the mayor about this all the time. I say, he's basically a full-time employee of the city, so spends Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 here, and then is also a full-time mayor. So to separate the legislative and the executive, to me, makes some sense. how we go about voting on ties is I think this governing body and future governing bodies are smart enough to figure that out. With regards to the budget, I will say that the relationship between the mayor and the city manager is key here. And I was here during the cost administration when the first city manager was hired. And because of that contentious relationship, that person lasted, I think, less than 6 months. So there's things that happen if that relationship does not work. And after that, I think things worked much better. And I believe that city manager at that time was the longest city manager that sat in that position in a long time. So I do believe that relationship can and should work.
If I may, Counselor, a number of times during our deliberations, we had to remind one another, draw a bright line between a constitutional document and the people who are selected to fulfill those roles. And the constitutional document is not is a different subject matter from personnel decisions. I want to make one comment, if I may, Counselor, about the process that Commissioner Ives just elucidated for you with regard to how much time is necessary for the charter work, right? You'll notice a sentence that needs to appear in a different part of our report, but has a bearing on that question. And that is the sequencing of these various things that happen every 10 years. When you consider all this and how to do it the next time, please remember this sentence: the census report and the charter report should be completed before the redistricting commission starts its work. We've been doing that backwards. And I can't tell you the number of times that just drives us into a pickle. So get that sequencing right, and a lot of this is going to become clearer.
Thank you for that, Mr. Dudek. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Counselor. I'm going to turn the gavel over to Counselor Lindell. I have a 4 o'clock commitment I can't break, but and I know you all have 5 o'clock committee meeting as well for quality of life. So I'm going to let Counselor Lindell take over and check in afterward. Thanks, everybody.
Don't give her the gavel. She's too heavy-handed with that.
Thank you. I too want to start by thanking the commission members. And I do want to stress the fact that you did a lot of work in a small amount of time. I think there were 12 meetings that the commission held. How many times did the subcommittees meet during that small amount of time?
At least as often as the commission, and sometimes more frequent.
So, I feel like there's great recommendations, and I'm disappointed that there wasn't enough time set in place for the details that may be missing, the research, which some of my colleagues have already mentioned, not be present in order to offer clear guidance. And I think that falls on the timeline that we initiated. And so I feel like I want to apologize for that for the public, because I think this is something that public guidance needs to kind of drive, and public education even prior to this process starting. Like, I feel like a lot of our public may not understand the charter, even know it exists. I feel like they might have, we really need to educate the public in understanding how it drives their government. And if we start this process by educating the public, then we'd have more involvement. And I think we would be setting the commission to be more successful in its recommendations. So I just wanted to add that comment. I definitely wish that we prepped our community for this work so that those connections were easier to make with the commission. I agree with the separation of powers. I do think that, thank you for saying that, Mr. Dudek, about the how we're doing things a little backwards. Because you also said something earlier when you said it would need to be a complete restructuring in our city government. And I feel like with some of the recommendations and the gaps it would take, looking at how we district, how our government is organized completely, which would be beyond the work that you could accomplish in the time that we'd set, and probably even the time that's set with the change. I think it's no less than 15 months before the election. Do you feel in your discussions, did you feel that there was more work that needed to be done prior to the report coming out? Were there questions that kind of were left on the table, not answered, even though the report was drafted and finalized from either commission member?
Madam Mayor Pro Tem and Counselor, I think that certainly would be affirmed to you by most, if not all, members of the commission. And to some degree, it's evidenced in the responses that Councilorwoman Villarreal's question about redlining and that sort of approach to presentation. Ultimately, when this goes to the voters, or whatever does go to the voters, it will have to be made clear what additions there are, what deletions there are, so that the voter can understand what the proposed changes are. When I work with documents and use redlining, and if they go through many iterations, I always describe them as becoming sort of they take on the aspect of Christmas, because there'll be blue, red, green, yellow, so many different colors that it's hard to even make sense of the changes that have been made. And ultimately, I think it was simply too much, too late to get that type of document prepared. But I would agree that is ultimately the objective, so that it is clear what, and that's just one example of where additional time could have been used. There certainly were other legal issues that might have been capable of being researched more. You know, there are subtle questions in there at different points in time. So yeah, more time would have been wonderful, I think, for everybody concerned.
And Mayor, Councilor, if I can add to that, I certainly agree with Mr. Ives' comments. I think you could say it was the sentiment of the commission that we had insufficient time. And it was evident by finally getting more of an array of comments and specific comments at the very end of our process once our webpage was up. And I think demonstrated by getting this Thornburg-Krebs report after we had already done our work. They never weighed in the entire time. We could have had more dialogue with those kinds of comments and research, I think, if we had had more time.
If I may add one sentence, Councilor, you all will remember when Councilor Villarreal asked the question, is it this coming November's election the only one that could be considered, or could we consider some other election cycle? And we had a discussion about that. And we did notice that you're free to bring this to the public as you choose. And I wanted you to hear that we had heard the same thing. And that's an important contribution to this discussion.
Absolutely. I think just to go back to my question a little bit too, in regards to the time, when you made the recommendations, and I know, you know, we have chair and 2 commission members here, from your perspectives, do you feel like those recommendations were made without a true finish, meaning that there was still discussion to be had, or there were maybe gaps in some of the recommendation due to the time constraint?
Mayor Pro Tem and Councilor Chavez, from my perspective, I would say I do not believe the recommendations themselves would have changed, but I do think that there could have been further details that could have been considered and worked out on implementation. But it's hard to know. I would just be speculating, but I think the recommendations were vetted and discussed, but how those would be put into practice was more of a difficult aspect in a short period of time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just on that same point, we actually did discuss on several occasions whether to try and come back to the governing body, possibly for an extension of the May 10th timeframe in which to provide the report that was given to the governing body. But there was a collective decision that given the timeframe pressures leading to the election and the need to do all of the additional work necessary to get for the governing body to evaluate, discuss, and take action on the recommendations, as well as all of the process of getting ready for an election, that we really wanted to complete the work within the time frame that had originally been set. And I would agree that we did discuss the proposals fairly thoroughly, so I'm not sure they would have changed. There certainly might have been additional debate on certain points, but I think everybody in the end was satisfied. I believe the vote was unanimous on the bringing the report forth to the governing body.
Thank you. And I have one more question for you, Councilor Ives, so if you don't mind hanging out there for a bit. I agree, as mentioned earlier, about the commission's work to continue. I get meeting the timeline, but I also think with ironed out details comes quicker action, right? So, you know, even if the process took longer, it in fact may have allowed the council to act more quickly because those details were, in a sense, ironed out and much more clear. I think that there's a lot of questions around some of the details and how things could work, and maybe a lack of research. And again, I think it has nothing to do with the commission's work. The amount of work put into this is pretty incredible. I wanted them to have an idea of, or the public, whoever is listening in, to have an idea of how many times you met, to understand the amount of work that went into such a small amount of time. So thank you for that. But I do think that guidance should have led to really providing time for clear follow through in the recommendations provided. And so and that's just my opinion and my comment on that. One last thing that I just wanted to see if you could offer insight on is the discussion within the subcommittee, your subcommittee for the Office of Equity and Inclusion. Just the conversations, details, it's something I'm incredibly interested in. I think we all know, living in Santa Fe, that there is a division, and there is, I think this could potentially be part of a solution, but it would have to be done very strategically and truly tied to community, very community driven. So I just wanted to hear how this was brought up in discussion within that subcommittee and just some of the comments through that.
Thank you for that question, Madam Mayor Pro Tem, Councilors, Councilor. There was certainly an awareness within the subcommittee when the form of resolution looking at the Office of Equity and Inclusion was brought forward. I believe everybody on the committee saw it. In fact, my recollection is it was distributed to all members of the commission, so everybody did have that. It, of course, addressed significantly issues relating to the Soldiers Monument, which is certainly within the ambit that can be considered as in this area of human rights and recognizing the various constituents within our city and their histories and the complexity of history. So just want to affirm that that was not outside the boundary of that, but we wanted to focus more specifically on a commission for human rights. And you'll note in the proposal that is brought forward, it speaks to creating an office of equity and inclusion, because we certainly agree that that is important. And one final point, I suppose, is that ordinances, of course, are both put forward and changed by the governing body. And again, I made the point earlier that human rights is so fundamental to our identity at this point in time, that having mechanism in the charter, so it's not something that a simple ordinance would have the capacity to remove, depending on changes in the governing body through time. So the effort was to make it a more permanent part of the city's governance structure.
Great, thank you so much. Again, I just want to thank you for your work. I also want to thank you on the emphasis of just making this process better, because I think that is a very important point to take away. So thank you. And Mayor Pro Tem, thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. So it's 5 minutes after 4. We have folks that have a 5 o'clock meeting, and we would like for them to have a little bit of a break. So if we did a second round and stuck at really and truly 5 minutes, how many people have burning questions for a second round? No? Councilor Rivera, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, not burning questions, but just some comments. As Councilor Michael Garcia stated, the quasi judicial process for us,
Speak into the mic.
sorry, I don't believe works very well. So trying to do something to fix that, I would definitely be interested in. Having legislative participation in the budget, and really having a city manager or the mayor really have some discussion with counselors from the respective districts on their priorities and what should be part of the budget. I don't think what we've been doing has been working, and would be interested in making some resolutions, whether it's to go to the voters or just to create an ordinance for the city. I think would be great for us. I think I am interested in some separation between the legislative and the executive, but I do worry about the veto authority, which I think was brought up by Councilor Romero Worth and by Pro Tem Lindell. And I don't know if we limit the veto authority to those matters that are unconstitutional or contrary to state or local laws. I don't know, but I think would be interested in having more discussion on that, and really seeing if we can come up with some kind of agreement on the veto power. Well, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Counselor. I had one I think Counselor Rivera, something you just said, I'm just going to emphasize it, that I think that some of these items and issues that we've been discussing don't necessarily need to be charter issues, that they're issues that as a council, we can work through legislatively. And personally, I do think that they're probably not charter issues. So thank you for bringing that up.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Councilor Romero Worth.
Just a couple quick comments. I don't want to delay us from having a break before quality of life. Completely agree, Councilor Rivera, that we do need to do something about our budget process, and that actually is something I'm actively looking at and hoping that we can change for the next round. We couldn't get it done for this round, but I'm actively looking at that, and I don't think we need a charter amendment or take that to the voters. That's something absolutely within our purview. I am very happy that Mr. Durdek brought up the sequencing of the district redistricting and the census and then the charter, because I think that is part of what created some issues in this round. But again, I don't think that work you know, was for naught, right? I think we know what we need to do, and we might not make it for this election, but I think long-term, I think there is, you know, some need to further, you know, break between the executive and the legislative. And of course, the number of counselors is an issue, and that's going to take some time. And I would note, I'm looking at the Charter Review Commission from the last round, and it starts that the Charter Review Commission was created by the governing body on April 25th, 2012, and it didn't get going until December of 2012. And then there were 16 meetings held of 2 to 4 hours in duration each. And there were many suggestions and comments from the public, as well as detailed communications from several organizations, members of the governing body, and staff. And the report is dated July 18th. So it was about 7 months that commission had to do your work. And so we have really, you know, asked you to do a hurry up offense. But there's, I don't know if you all have been watching, but there is a similar conversation going on in Albuquerque. And I believe Councillor Cassett noticed that when they went to their quote unquote strong mayor and where they took the mayor off of the council and gave that mayor veto authority, that process took 18 months. And so I think if this is the direction we want to go, we do need to give proper time, and we need to, and proper resources, and we need to get the sequencing right. And maybe we need to grow just a little bit as a city so that we can make the argument for some of those changes. So again, I am very thankful for your work, and I think it plants the seeds for things that we need to start to figure out how to work towards. That's all I have, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Villarreal.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Just had a couple questions on if you could just elaborate more about the boards and commissions. And then also the Open Meetings Act. Especially the Open Meetings Act, there was a recommendation, but I was trying to figure out how it was different than what we already have in place for the Open Meetings Act requirements.
Peter and I were trying to decide which one of us dealt with that one. The question that you asked first, Counselor.
Boards and
What was that?
commissions.
Boards and commissions.
Sunset?
That came from one of our commissioners who believed that Santa Fe has many, many more commissions that it has to populate than are actually active, and wanted to simply find a way to get more streamlined about that and more productive about it. But we also felt, as you can see, that that's really not charter business.
Did you all talk in that vein about boards and commissions about representation on those boards? And
We did not.
okay. Thank you. And then Open Meetings Act piece was about, yeah, I'm not sure the piece on this, what the discussion was for this particular item.
Madam Mayor Pro Tem, Councilor Villarreal. This is definitely one area where we could have used more time. It was brought up late in the process, and I think to some degree it was the sense of the commission or the consensus of the commission that having any boards and commissions that are created by the city, that they should follow the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. And there was a caveat, however, and this is seen in current practice within the city, where they are advisory in nature, so not making decisions and therefore not necessarily technically subject to the Open Meetings Act. There is a greater opportunity for participation via remote means, Zoom and otherwise, which can be used to maximize potentially public input and participation in the process. So we did not have really time to craft the language because we were going back within those parameters, trying to figure out how you would affirm that you would like to see all the boards and commissions observe the requirements of the Open Meetings Act, but craft an exception so that you could maximize public participation and presence in that process. That was, in my mind, left a little incomplete.
Right. Yeah, I think that that's a topic that needs further investigation and discussion. I think, looking at my notes, we didn't talk anything about the referendums. And if there was anything you wanted to share about recalls, I know there was a suggestion on, maybe you could distinguish the two different ideas. One was not to change it, one was to change it, but if you could just explain the difference between the two.
Thank you for that question. We noticed that the 33 1/3% that applied to all three categories was excessive and is not observed in many cities. The maximum usually is something like 12 to 15, and there are some cities for which it's 2. But in the case of recall, we did not believe that changing the present rule made as much was as required as it is in the other two cases, because every voter has an opportunity to go back to the polls and vote again. And your provision on recall already says that recalls cannot be done within the year prior to an election, right? And so it's only possible within certain number of years of the term. That being said, the rules as it stands today seem to us to be adequate with regard to recall. With the other two, however, the threshold is much too high to make those two real possibilities for the public. Please notice that it's just as important, if and when you ever see a red line version of this, the last sentence on each of those cases gives guidance to the clerk as to how the number of percent is to be calculated. Percent of what? And the language in the present charter is absolutely opaque when it comes to those rules. Anybody can interpret that any way they want to, and it's very, very confusing. And so we have provided a lot more specific language in each of those sentences about how exactly we expect those percentages to be calculated.
And the suggestion you did have for a change from 33.3% to 15%.
That's with regard to referendum and initiative. Those are cases where the voters want to express themselves directly with regard to a topic.
Any topic,
Sure.
not a piece of legislation
Uh,
or a policy.
I think Counselor Aaron, can you help us on that one?
What did you say?
You are our counselor, are you?
Mayor Pro Tem Councilors, I think he switched the use of counselor from counselor to counselor in the last minute there. So I'm not sure I followed the question. Is this still about referendums initiative?
Yes.
And the question is,
Do they apply to everything, all topics, or do they apply only to legislative matters?
okay, let's pull up the, well, I'm not sure I can respond on behalf of what the recommendation is, but the question about the current charter?
It's trying to understand what can be if there's a referendum, what they're trying to it's in response to what action taken by the city council, something that happened down on the plaza. I mean, I'm confused about what that applies to. What the other one was very clear because it was about a recall of the elected official. And there was no suggested recommended changes for that threshold.
Counselor, I think the confusion is our fault. If you notice, in each of those recommendations, we cite a number, right? 3.2, see that? In each of those, that is the part of the ordinance on initiative, and the rest of the ordinance on initiative, we didn't put in the recommendation at all. So this is one of those cases where we've only altered the percentage of signatures. The other provisions about how you define an initiative and how you define a referendum, they are amply described in your current charter, and we're making no changes whatsoever, which is why you don't see it in front of you. But if you look at the charter, it describes that to a fairly well.
And to that point, Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Villarreal, so right of referendum is the right to repeal an adopted ordinance specifically. And there's certain prohibitions to that authority or a power. The limitations include the budget, which we don't adopt by ordinance anyway, but if we were to do so, the capital program, any ordinance appropriating money, the levy of taxes, unless the referendum is specifically authorized by state law. So there's a list of carve outs, including zone map amendments and ordinances authorizing bonds. So there's certain types of ordinances that would not be included, but in general, referendum would be to address an ordinance. An initiative would be to propose ordinances. So both for ordinances. And those are specifically addressed in 301 and 302.
Thanks for the clarification. I was trying to figure out if you were reading somewhere separate, but you're talking about the language that's currently in our document. Again, that was why I was like, is this existing or is this?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, Councilor Villarreal, I am reading from the charter. And I think that is how there's some confusion because 301 has parts A through K in relation to initiative and A through J in relation to referendum. And these changes would just be to E under 301 and F under 302.
Okay.
There's various other provisions under those sections.
Thank you. I think that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Do we have any other items on our agenda, Madam Clerk?
Mayor Pro Tem Lindell, we do have just timelines for proposing potential ballot questions by resolution.
Can we go to the next item, please?
Sure. Item 7B is timelines for proposing potential ballot questions by resolution. Attorney McSherry or myself can answer. We also have kind of a slide. I could probably screen share if you'd like.
Please proceed.
Aaron will also send an email to you as well, so you have them. Helpful. Okay, this will be coming to your email shortly. But let me know, I can also increase this size. If we were to have a timeline and aim to have something on the November ballot, then we are working back from the August 29th date, which is the day that the county clerk, it's a deadline for her to receive the ballot questions, both in English and Spanish. We have a council meeting on August 9th, which is the last regular governing body meeting before the county clerk's August 29th deadline. Our next meeting is the day after that. So based on that, we came up with July 26th as the regular deadline to introduce a resolution that wouldn't have fiscal impact. And we wouldn't be sending that resolution to the finance committee. Or we would need to send, that to the finance committee, council committee without finance committee. Sorry, I'm jumbling that. Normally for legislation, we go to finance committee last. We would alter it in this particular situation if we introduce legislation on the 26th. But again, we're kind of really hoping that July 5th would be the suggested time for legislative requests. We could get requests in by that date. Then, of course, staff from the attorney's office would look to have that legislation completed so that we could have information in the July 12th meeting for introduction. And then you can see we'll follow the committee process for legislation and have items on the July 12th meeting. And then again, if we wanted to basically introduce a resolution without fiscal impact or alter the order of our committee structure, then we could introduce at the next council meeting. Does that help, Councilor Lindell, or have a timeline?
And Mayor Pro Tem Councilors, I would say as soon as possible before July 5th would be legislative requests, because the internal staff deadline to prepare packets for July 12th, which would be the recommended introduction date, is July 5th. So, and we are getting a lot of legislative requests, quite a few.
Thank you. The email did just come through. So everyone can review that and proceed as required by these timelines. I think if you have questions on them, you probably need to address them to Attorney McSherry or County Clerk Mahalsick. So I think that this email is pretty clear about what the timeline is. So, does anybody have a comment on that? Okay, then thank you again to the Charter Committee folks for all your work and for coming today. We really do appreciate it. And with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.